Hello, and welcome to Book World: The Great Escape. I'm CJ Peterson. Co-host, if I can point the correct direction, is author Michael Scott Clifton. And down below, we have today a special guest, Mr. Caleb Pirtle. So thank you guys for coming on today, Mr. Caleb. We really appreciate you.
I'm
Mike,
glad to be here.
Thank you. Mike, how was your week? You're muted, Mike.
It was going good until last night when I started getting COVID-like symptoms again. So today,
Oh no.
today I'm going to be going to get tested for the second time in 3 weeks. So if there's a prize for how many times you catch COVID, I think I'd be up there with some of the winners. So anyway,
Winner,
other than
winner,
that,
chicken dinner?
yeah. Anyway, it's a pretty good week. Good New Year.
Well, I saw that you were able to actually. Whose puppy is that? I saw that you were able to go see your was it your nephew? Your son, your grandson. You finally were able to go see your grandson.
Well, they came for Christmas, or actually they came last week to make up for Christmas when Melly and I both had COVID. So yeah, we were able to see him. But then my son-in-law got sick while they were here, and they had to leave a day early and go back home. So it's been it's been kind of a wild ride. So
shame.
Yep.
And now you got it again.
Well, I don't know that. As we were talking a little bit earlier, everything's blamed on COVID now. Could be flu, although I had a flu vaccine. It only works 60% of the time, so it could be, could have had something else. But I will hope it's flu and it's not the COVID again. But anyway, today I'm feeling a lot better, so it may all be, behind me anyway. So
gotcha.
But thank you for asking.
You're welcome. We ended up having the cold, flu, and COVID all at the same time. And as soon as we got that done, we were finally somewhat healthy last Monday. Believe it or not, getting old sucks. I picked up a load of laundry to put it in the washer and I threw my back out. Like, seriously, how does that even happen? Like, what in the world? So I literally couldn't stand, sit, bend over, lay down, nothing for like, I don't know, for like 3 or 4 days before it finally hit that. Mr. Leroy Usury says vitamin C and zinc. Yep, that's what we did. We did vitamin C, vitamin D3, zinc, magnesium, and calcium. That was what our regimen was, and elderberry. So we were able to kick it a little bit better because that's kind of like a natural version. So that's what helped us kind of stay ahead of it. And we also had a vaporizer with the Vicks steam in it. And that helped us out immensely too, to be able to lay down and sit. Well, today we have a special guest I'm super excited about, Mr. Caleb Pirtle III. Welcome to Book World: The Great Escape.
Well, it's glad to be here.
Mr. Pirtle, you are a historical fiction author. Can you explain to those who are watching what that is? Like the difference, like what does a historical fiction author write? How do they do it? That sort of thing.
Well, it helps to be kind of like I am. I live in the present, but I prefer the past. I find going back and researching about times past, especially in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, it's just absolutely, totally fascinating. The stories, the noir value, there's all sorts of wonderful ways to tell a story. And it also helps to be as old as I am. I lived through most of my historical fiction. In fact, I did not know that I wrote historical fiction
until you realized you were writing
that way. I was just writing about my experiences growing up.
Got it. So I know
during World War II,
Mhm.
My father worked in a bomb plant.
Mhm.
And so we lived on site, and they would cart everybody in the neighborhood down to a little auditorium at least once a week and show military propaganda films of all the terrible things going on in Germany, the terrible things going on in Japan. And really, it was almost like a pep rally to get everybody fired up to run out and build those bombs. So when I started writing about the late 1930s, the build up to World War II, and even the series with the World War II as a backdrop, I had a lot of emotional nostalgia tied into it
Mhm.
because you see things when you're a kid and you forget them. And then all of a sudden, when you research, you run across a phrase, a moment, a time, an incident when everything suddenly just floods back to you.
Mhm.
And that's when writing historical fiction really takes off for me.
Gotcha. Now, we've talked before in book world about being a planner author or a pantser author. We've talked on both. Mike and I are pantsers, but being a historical fiction author, you actually kind of are forced to be a planner, correct? Because you have to
Well,
do all that research.
well, once you decide what your basic story is,
Mhm.
you do a whole lot of research.
Mhm.
In fact, weeks and weeks of research. I'm in the process of doing research now, and the biggest problem facing me writing historical fiction is to suddenly wake up and realize I need to quit researching and start writing. Because
Mhm.
every time you research, you stumble across a wonderful nugget buried in all that mud. And that leads to another nugget. And the next thing you know, you're off in a story you had no intention of writing in the first place. And often the second story is better than the one you thought you wanted to write.
That happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
So Caleb, I would like to get your thoughts on with historical fiction. Okay, you do a lot of research, which are actually historical fact. So where
Right.
does the history part end and the fiction begin, or how do you meld the two? Because you're writing a fictional story, but you're actually basing it on. Because I've been fortunate enough to read some of your books, and I can tell that the research has been done in terms of the clothes that people wear, the mode of transportation, like locomotives, that sort of thing. Uh, so, how do you mesh that where you go from the research you've done and make it into a fictional story about characters that you've come up with in your mind?
Well, the research creates the big backdrop, the historical backdrop, the background and the setting in which the story will take place. And like you mentioned, Mike, authenticity is absolutely critical. When I first started writing, I probably didn't realize it as much as I should because in the first draft of my first uh, World War II piece, I had my espionage character armed with a Glock in 1939. And my editor said, I'm sorry, but the
Mhm.
Glock didn't come in until the 1950s.
Yeah.
So it
Mm,
suddenly dawned on me, if you're not extra careful and you don't spend that extra time of researching, as soon as you start writing about things that if your clothing is not right, the weapons is not right, the locations aren't right, you lose all credibility. And in this game that we play called writing, if you lose your credibility on one book, it's hard to get it back, and sometimes you never get it back for any other book.
mm.
Mhm.
So I spend as much time researching fiction as I do nonfiction. And
Mhm.
like you say, everything in the book is as accurate as it can possibly be. The only difference is you take your characters and put them in that situation, and your characters form the fictional part of the nonfiction.
Okay.
And the thing is, you know, the characters may be in the middle of a well-known historical event. Your fiction is what they do and especially their point of view, what they're thinking, what goes through their minds when certain things take place. And then you get you get a certain uh, self-satisfaction about the research. And one of my books, the scene takes place in Polway, Poland, where a band of Jewish villagers are waiting on the platform for a train, and they have no idea where the train will take them. And I did enough research to find the actual name of the company and the number on the train that picked up the Jews in Polway, Poland. Now, when people read the book, they will probably think that name is fiction, and it very well could be, but I know it's truth, and so I can sleep better at night.
So how do you find those little nuggets like that? Because I would think trying to find like the actual name of the train and all that stuff would be difficult. It's not like you can just Google, hey, what's the name of the train and what you call it? How do you
Well,
find that stuff?
well, basically, I knew the setting was in Polway, Poland.
Mhm.
So I researched everything I could find on Polway. And in that bit of research, I realized that a train came to Polway. So then I researched the train, why it came, and found out that the Germans were sending that train for the sole purpose of picking up the Jewish villagers that they had rounded up. And no one knew where they were going. And so you just let one little thread lead you to the next thread. And like I say, the next thing you know, you're off on a story that you're so glad you found, because it really gives depth and meaning to the story you're writing. Because, well, whether you write pure fiction, well, whether it's fantasy, whether it's Christian fiction, whether it's historical fiction, you've got to leave enough threads of truth in there that it touches people emotionally, and they say, yeah, the story's fiction, but once upon a time, this really happened to somebody. We may never know their names, we may never know what happened to them, but they were affected by this incident.
Mhm.
And that gives the book a whole lot more meaning than it would be otherwise.
Now, I have a question, might be kind of a sensitive question. With the way society is now and trying to kind of whitewash a lot of history and be careful, politically correct and stuff like that, how do you write accurate historical fiction, you know, balancing the two, balancing between being still politically somewhat correct but factually accurate? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, and that's probably a real problem
Mhm.
for writers who write about the present. Uh, well, when you're writing about the 1920s or the 1930s, there is not really that emphasis on being politically correct.
No, I'm talking about the books that are historical fiction,
Yeah.
but they're being published now. So, like, for example, Laura Ingalls Wilder stuff was accurate, but there was a big to-do about her books. And, she ended up losing that one award, and these schools started pulling her books off the shelves. So, how do you balance between, yes, this happened, and yes, that's the way it was back then, and, making sure that your books don't light a fire under somebody that would, you know what I'm saying?
You know,
Cause
that really
issues.
hadn't bothered me because, as I say, the backdrop is historical and
Mhm,
as accurate as I can possibly make it. The story is fictional.
mhm.
You know, it's sold, it's marketed, it's promoted, it's defined as fiction.
Okay.
The fact that it's historically accurate just leads credence. As I said, a book needs to have a deeper meaning, but that doesn't necessarily mean it needs to have a political story to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not
Right.
for that
Right.
sort of stuff, but I just wanted to know how you balanced that out
Yeah, I just
without.
yeah, as long as my backdrop is totally accurate as I can make it, uh, then I don't worry about the characters.
Got
It
it.
was just like
Mhm.
my trilogy on the East Texas oil boom on the
Mhm.
Boomtown series. I lived in Kilgore. I grew up in Kilgore. I knew what it looked like and what it felt like and what it smelled like, and I knew all those characters. And
Mhm.
you would be in restaurants with them and overhear their stories and hear them telling all sorts of yarns, and that kind of crawls into your psyche, and
Mhm.
it crawls into those empty cells in your brain, and it stays there. And then one day you think, I've got all these wonderful stories to tell. I need to find a vehicle in which I can tell these stories. And so that's why I wrote the Boomtown series.
So you got kind of a little bit of an inside track there.
I had an inside track. I mean, I
That is
grew up drinking water that smelled like oil that tasted like.
true. Well, Caleb, again, I've been fortunate enough to read some of your books,
Mhm.
and I wanted to ask you a question about your writing style. One of the things I've noticed that in the books that you write is you go to great detail to embellish the scene or the description. Like you don't just say it's a moon, you say it's a luminous moon that filled half the sky, and you describe the surroundings. Do you use that? I would like you to talk a little bit about your approach on embellishment, particularly because what I found nowadays, unfortunately, is that a lot of readers are impatient readers
Mhm.
and they don't appreciate, uh, you know, uh, more description as opposed to less. So, how do you approach that when, like your writing style, when you are describing a scene?
I think most writers, myself included, will ultimately wind up with a writing style that they prefer to read. Uh, they're minimalists. They're people who just go straight to the story, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. I read a lot of books that way and enjoy every one of them. But what I really enjoy is since you're writers, all the book is one scene stitched against the next scene.
Mhm.
And when I take a reader to that scene, I want that lead paragraph. And usually I go into great detail on that lead paragraph where I try to let the reader see what I see and hear what I hear, and think about what I'm thinking, and in order to really get them set. And then I go straight into dialogue, and especially a lot of internal dialogue. As you know, I do quick paragraphs, 2-word paragraphs, 3-word paragraphs, single sentence paragraphs. Once you get past that description, it's almost like, and I've had the fortune to do several film scripts. And like in a film, each scene starts with a master shot,
Mhm.
which is the overall shot. For example, if you're in a restaurant, you see the overall restaurant. You know what it looks like. You know the kind of people are there. You know the music that's in the background. You know whether people are dancing. You know whether there's a lot of light, whether there's a very dim light, where it's an old-fashioned decor or a brand new mod decor. And you get the feel and the ambiance, and you understand what you're fixing to walk into. And then they go to the characters and start the dialogue. I guess what I'm trying to do when I write is set that master scene. This is where you're going. Now that I've got you here, let's see what the characters have to say about it.
Yeah,
But
Well,
I've read
that's
I've
basically the reason I do it, Mike.
I've read some of your books, and it's like you're walking back in time the way you've got it all set up. It's like, okay, you're actually physically it's almost like you feel like you're physically walking into the scene and you're just looking around because you're saying everything that's going on. So you don't have to repeat it later down the road
No,
either
no.
because it's already there.
Yeah,
And
it's
whether we
in,
come back to the oil field or back to the saloon or back to wherever, we've already been there, so we know what it looks like, and you can just keep going
right.
forward.
Well, I like your. I mean, I like your style of writing, Caleb. I like
Mhm.
description. I like embellishment. It's like a painting. You can draw in stick figures, or you can actually add color and depth to it. And
that's exactly right.
Mhm.
and I like your embellishments.
Well, I
So
appreciate that. Now, Linda's the type. My wife, she goes into a book that has a lot of description, a lot of paragraphs with the description, and she's one of those readers that says, in a long paragraph, I read the first sentence and the last sentence, and I got it. So
But you're giving
He
people the
probably doesn't have
option.
an affinity for it that I do.
Yeah, you're giving people the option, though, of either jumping into the scene or skimming past it. So for those who like to jump into the scene and walk back in time, you're giving them a choice of doing it. So
Now,
my question, sorry.
oh, I was just going to add, I've been reading, because I write in the fantasy genre,
Mhm.
Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series, which is,
Right.
supposed to be up there with, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and stuff. The average word count on each of his books was 250,000 word count. And he wrote 13
Wow.
books. But the difference, I think, Caleb, between how you write and because I've read his books, is with him, and I think that's sort of a weakness of fantasy, and I say that as a fantasy writer, is that you're not really you're not really adding to the description. It's more like filler, like the packaging you stick inside an envelope. It's not that important to the to the overall story, the characters, or where you're going. So, but yours always has been, at least books that I've read. It's all been part of whatever scene's being set. And like I said, I like good description, because as a reader, I would think that's what you would want. You want to see that in your mind, But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Well, you're exactly right. And fantasy may be the last genre, I guess, fantasy and science fiction, where the books are long. I mean,
mine aren't. mine are sci-fi, and they're about like this.
but fantasy writers, it's almost like you start at 150,000 and grow from there. But by the same token, I also understand that in fantasy, you have to build a world,
yes,
and show that world off. Whereas we who just write straight fiction or historical fiction, generally the reader knows what the world looks like.
Right.
Maybe not that particular era in time, but what the world looks like. And fantasy writers have to create a whole new look, a whole new feel. And I think that's probably one of the fascinating things that draw people into reading fantasy and probably writing fantasy.
So do you have any advice for somebody who's considering writing historical fiction? For example, I've got a variety of genres, and one of my books coming up is going to be sort of historical fiction. They're bouncing through time. So do you have any advice for somebody who's considering writing historical fiction?
I think probably what writers need to do is write, if they're in historical fiction, write about that era that totally fascinates them. For example, a friend of ours, Mike, I think knows Bill Phillips. Bill Phillips, he loves wagon trains. I mean, every book he writes, there's a wagon train going from the East Coast to the West Coast. There are other people who love to write World War One. They just they fall in love with an era and basically pack up and move there, mentally, physically, and emotionally. And if you're trying to write about an era that you're not really in love with, it becomes a real chore. It becomes laborious. And when you're writing, if you're having to fight your way through a story and fight your way through a scene, then you need to take that manuscript and throw it away and start over.
Yeah,
because if you really love your book, and if you have to fight your way through it, a reader who knows nothing about your book will never get past page 10.
Yeah, I told somebody just this week, if there's no tears from the writer, there's no tears from the reader. If there's no laughter from the writer, there's no laughter from the reader. So if you're fighting to get through the story, the reader's going to be fighting with you. And that's just not a good story.
No. It's just like in some scenes I have written, and you probably have too, and you write it, and by the time you end that particular scene, you're in tears. I mean, you're just emotionally drained.
There's times I've had to go back and change the scene because I couldn't do it.
Yeah, and the fear you have will my reader be as emotionally drained as I am? Maybe I should go back and work on that scene. And I figure if you have to go back and work on it, it didn't work the first time.
Mhm.
So I just feel if it touched me that way,
Yeah.
maybe it'll touch the reader. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
So, for those who aren't familiar with you or your work, could you tell us in about 3 or so minutes about you and your books?
Well, I'm one of these people who started writing a long time ago and have been writing all my life. That's all I've ever done. Uh, I majored in journalism at the University of Texas, worked on small newspapers, worked on large newspapers, the Star Telegram in Fort Worth. I was first travel editor at Southern Living magazine. And you know, at Southern Living, we made a living writing about the historical South. So I really got into historical there. And I've written a little over 85 books. And in the beginning, probably a great majority of those books are historical oriented or travel oriented. And a lot of travel deals with history. So I spent most of my life living in the past and kind of enjoy it there.
Well, Caleb, I know that because I've known you for a few years now, and I know that you have mentored a lot of authors, that especially those like myself a number of years ago that were starting out. And one of the things you told me, and I've mentioned this on our Book World blog, one of the things you told me that has always stuck with me was when I think I was discouraged because the book I was writing, I don't know that I had a grammatical grasp of, you know, the way it should be written. And what you told me was, Mike, you have a great story. And I'm paraphrasing, but you've got a great story. The story's the most important thing. You can fix the other part, but if you don't have a good story, you can't fix that. So, um, and like I said, I know you've mentored a lot of authors down through the years, and I know of a number of people that I didn't even know you had contact with that I've talked to. So you've made quite an impact on the writing community, at least here in East Texas.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, kind of like both of you. Well, one of my great delights in life is sitting around the table with other writers, just discussing ideas,
Mhm.
discussing how we do things. And I think the wonderful thing about being a writer is that none of us do the same thing the same way.
Mhm.
And very seldom do we do the same thing twice.
Mhm.
Uh, but one of the fascinating things is I've always heard, especially at writers' conferences, so many writers say, you know, I'm always afraid that my story idea, somebody's going to steal it. And my thought is, let them steal it.
Mhm.
You can take one plot, one story idea, and give it to 12 different people and come up with 12 different novels, none of which resemble the other, because our minds uh, just ramble on different tracks in different trains to different parts of the country. And I think that's what's fascinating.
For example, all 3 of us were actually part
Yeah,
of
and the
this
thing,
particular anthology, and it was us, I think, was there 12 total authors? 10 or 12?
I think there were 12.
12 total authors, the underground authors. We were given this particular picture and told to write a short story about it. The various genres and storylines from just this one picture that's in this anthology are insane. They're really good, but they're all completely different. Just as each author is different, they have a different perspective on, what they're seeing and what they're looking at and what's standing out to them. So,
Well, we all see our lives through a different pair of eyes
mhm,
and different perspectives. We all see the stories the same way. And then the way that you would run through a story, or Mike would run through a story, and I would run through a story is so totally different.
mhm.
That makes all 3 books with the same plot fascinating to read.
Yep, exactly. We have exactly 1 minute left. Is there anything you would like to add, sir?
No, I just think to go on what Mike said earlier, if you want to be a writer, if there's a desire deep within your heart to write, then come up with a story that you believe in, that you've enjoyed living in, and write that story the best way you can write it.
Mhm.
It's like James Michener said, I'm not a very good writer, but I'm a great rewriter.
Nice.
And always rewrite it and make it the way you want it.
Well, thank you for coming on today, Caleb. You were a
Awesome.
true
Thank you.
pleasure. I have made sure to get your website out there. Anybody who's interested in Caleb's books, check them out. He has an awesome selection, and you can find them on calebandlindapirtle.com. He also has a blog that he does various different authors. He kind of highlights them through it, and you can kind of look there and see if you can find your next favorite book from there. But you were a joy to talk to, sir. Thank you so much for coming
Thank
on.
you so much for letting me be
Thank
here.
you.
You're kind.
And next week at 1 o'clock, same time, same sandbox, Book World will return, and we're going to be discussing critique groups and partners, yay or nay. So until next time, we'll see you later.